How do sex, language, and madness resonate with philosophy? Is Derrida a Marxist or not? Or maybe both? And how can we understand the contemporary struggles over identity? These elements and questions compose today's topic, the culture wars. Welcome to Political Compositions, where we explore the last 250 years of political, social, and cultural philosophy. I am Jamie.
I'm Gijs.
And join us in confronting the foremost philosophers, movements, and ideas from past and present, which compose political philosophy today. So turn on, tune in, but don't drop out.
So, Jamie, what can we expect from today's episode?
To be honest, I'm not quite sure. Actually, I'm sort of confused. The culture wars, are they over or are they just beginning?
Let me answer you in the style of Zizek. Yes.
Okay, so I guess you mean the answer is both, or that the question is wrong.
Again, yes. The culture wars have been here for half a century or maybe a whole century, depending on how you look at it. And even the question what we mean by culture wars, whether they're over or just beginning, depends on how you look at it.
So the answer is relativistic.
Well, no. And yes, it's better to call it perspectivist.
The difference being?
Perspective is not necessarily subjective or relativist. It can be more objectified by the usual academic means. Sources, verification, falsification, arguments, references to literature. Yet different perspectives cannot always be pasted together into a single coherent picture, or perhaps not at all.
So perspectives depend on each other exactly in the sense of being incompatible. Is that a fair statement? In that case, it would sound more dialectical, like the class struggle.
Yes and no. Yes, it is in that sense like class struggle. But no, the culture wars, or at least in their present form, are beyond class struggle. They originate precisely at the moment when the class struggle is no longer seen as the original dominant self-evident principle on which society and its power relations rests, at least as previously seen by those on the left, especially, of course, the Marxist left.
Okay, so culture wars are beyond class struggle, but they are not beyond struggle. Otherwise, we wouldn't call it a war.
No doubt about it. Culture is struggle, a fight over values. This was how Nietzsche, and with him, for instance, Max Weber, thought about culture. Culture is not the expression of some homogeneous or self-evidently shared thing, some safe or stable entity that you can find yourself at home in and worm yourself at. And even if it is, this is because it is the product and the consequence of what once was an intense and most likely violent confrontation, or the later celebration of that kind of confrontation.
Right, like we saw earlier with Beethoven, with his Third Symphony, he intended to celebrate the creation of a new political world by Napoleon, or rather his spirit.
Or an attempt to destroy the old and bring about something new. Like we discussed with Wagner, who saw his operas as revolutionary vehicles that would change the world through the affects it appealed to, in a revolution of the senses, or through the senses, so to speak.
An idea which Nietzsche shared, right? At the time, at least, when he was a young and fervent admirer of Wagner.
Nietzsche even wrote the program booklet for Wagner's operas. Well, a very philosophical booklet. Die Geburt der Tragödie aus dem Geiste der Musik. So the birth of tragedy out of the spirit of music, which was his first book and immediately made him famous.
And it's still being read a lot.
And rightly so.
Okay, great. So how do we get from this idea of culture as somehow violent, confrontational, and effective, associated with thinkers and artists like Wagner, Nietzsche, and Weber, to our topic of culture wars in our time and in our world?
For me, this connection lies in these valuations of the violent, the confrontational, and the affective. These were picked up again in a different time and different form in the cultural and social movements of the 1960s and 70s, like civil rights movement, the French student protests of May 68, the Vietnam War protests, and so on. And in some of the philosophical views of these times as well, especially in certain styles of French philosophy.
I think we should help the listener here a bit, because certain styles of French philosophy seems to beat around the bush a little. Are we talking here about what is sometimes called French theory, or maybe even more ominous to some, about postmodernism?
Yeah, so this is about what is called French theory, although that is often used in a somewhat pejorative way.
As is postmodernism, if that is a meaningful term at all.
Definitely. But let's be more concrete indeed. We are talking here about philosophers like Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze, and Lyotard. The French theory is a somewhat ironical reference to the fact that while these philosophers were quite well known in France in the 1960s and 70s, in certain subcultural or countercultural circles, they reached a kind of pop star status after their work was, so to speak, exported to the United States. It really was all over American university campuses, especially the Ivy League ones, so the posh and wealthy ones, where the future intellectual and political elites are being formed.
Oh, how ironic.
Very. Also, the Ivy League colleges tend to be the most ethnically segregated ones. Each ethnicity its own private corner, so to speak.
Sounds a lot like the racist coding of previous American segregationist legal policy. Separate but equal. Of course, not really equal.
In a way, yes, but here exactly because they are so hyper-race conscious. So it's a form of voluntary segregation, although they would themselves say that social and political powers are to blame. You might nowadays see this in terms of the creation of safe spaces.
Although the ideal of the safe space counterintuitively confronts us with how unsafe many of us feel.
Yes, again, more irony, or dialectics, if you like. But culture wars and French theory cannot really be understood without what you would call a new valuation of violence and the affective in the 1960s and 70s. Think of the famous sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Well, I missed out on those days, so.
Mostly, so did I, to be frank. Hard to say if this is an eternal shame or that we just lucked out. When I started university in the mid-70s, most of this party was over, although there was still an after party going on, so to speak. Emancipation was there, feminism, Marxism, and lots of protest, squatting, democratization, you name it, they got it. And all of this was touched by this valuation of violence and the affective.
So does that mean that people were more violent and effective then and confrontational, or am I being too simplistic now?
Violent, maybe not so much, although squatting did get more violent by then, as did the landlords and their hired thugs, I should add. Confrontational, for sure. Traditional authorities in politics and in the university turned out to be weak and more pompous than self-confident. So out with the old, in with the new.
Which even happened to Theodor Adorno, right?
Yes, then one of the heroes or grand old men of the Frankfurt School critical theory, and thus you would think of the student protest generation. But after the building of the Institut für Sozialforschung was occupied by students who demanded more democracy, Adorno called the police to have them removed.
I mean, something in me truly dislikes calling the police for anything. And this is starting to sound all too familiar. I mean, in the past years, we are making this podcast in the spring of 2024. Student protests have sprung up in many university cities against climate change, or rather ties to fossil fuel industry, and now also against the war in Gaza. Students are angry because they feel that those in charge of the university should somehow speak out on these issues. And they also occupy university buildings in protest against these authorities.
Yes, although in Adorno's time, the MO of the students,
their modus operandi, the way of going about these things, say,
was quite different. Some months later, while lecturing, Adorno was being besieged by militant students, demanding that he exercise public self-criticism. So basically, put himself to shame in front of all the students by admitting his mistakes.
Wow, okay. So a different beast then, more like the classic Stalinist show trials, isn't it?
For sure. But perhaps it's also classical male style, because as a follow-up, female students surrounded our poor Adorno and did something very different. They were strewing petals all over, including all over Adorno, and baring their breasts. Traditional academic propriety, to which Adorno was quite attached, was completely breached. Students wanted to show that theory, with a capital T, could also be personal, non-authoritarian, approachable, personal, and sensitive, also in a sexual sense.
Ah, that's cool. I mean, it's like a performance act that is both brutal and sensual, hard and soft, political and personal. Spirit of the times, I guess.
Performance is the right word here. Think of Marina Abramovic. No better illustration of this particular spirit. The culture was embodied very literally, although in her case not in university or in politics, but in art. She sort of single-handedly invented performance art in exactly the time and the spirit of those days.
One of my most extreme pieces was when I really pushed my body to the limits, because I didn't ever want to die. I'm not interested in dying, but I'm interested in how far you can push the energy of the human body, how far you can go, and then see that actually our energy is almost limitless. It's not about the body, it's about the mind who push you to the extremes that you never could imagine. Some of the work, what really got lots of attention from the public, was Rhythm Zero. Till that time, the artist of performance art was totally ridiculous, and they think that was sick, and there was exhibitionist, and there was masochist, and they just want attention. So I was just really tired of this kind of critics, and I said, okay, I'm going to make the piece to see how far public can go if the artist himself doesn't do anything. And there, very simply, I put on the table 72 objects with the instructions: I'm an object, you can do whatever you want to do with me, and I will take all responsibility for 6 hours. On the table was a rose, perfume, piece of bread, and grapes, and wine, and then was objects like really scissors and nails and a metal bar, and finally was also a pistol with 1 bullet. So basically, if the audience wanted to put a bullet into a pistol, can kill me. And I really want to take this risk. I want to know what is the public about and what they're going to do in this kind of situation. It was a really difficult piece because I just stood there in the front of that table, and in the beginning nothing really happened. Public would come, they would play with me, they would give me a rose, they would kiss me, look at me, and then public became more and more wild. They cut my neck and drink my blood. They carry me around, put me on the table, open my legs and put a knife between. The one person took the pistol, put the bullet, and see if I would really, with my own hand, push the target. The galleries came and completely go crazy, take this gun out of his hand, throw out of the window. They took a scissor, they cut my clothes, they put rose pins into my body. After 6 hours, which was like 2 in the morning, the galleries come and say the performance is over. I start moving and start being myself, because I was there like a puppet just for them. And that moment, everybody ran away. People could not actually confront with me as a person.
Abramovich was great, but what is the connection again with our philosophers like Derrida and Foucault?
They all give expression to the revolution of the 1960s and 70s, a cultural revolution that was also an artistic revolution and a revolution in philosophy.
Okay, and how are we to understand this revolution in philosophy? What was it about?
Madness, sexuality, and language. That was a shorter answer than you expected, right?
Yes. So let's try to make it more expansive for once, or unpack it, as it is sometimes said in academic lingo. So language, okay, I can see a plausible relation with philosophy there, I guess, but madness and sexuality?
Actually, all 3 are related. With madness, I mean the idea proposed by Michel Foucault that the distinction between what rational is and what is irrational, which is the foundation of the Enlightenment, is not an achievement of clarity of mind, as philosophers like Descartes believed, but the expression of a social division. It means stigmatizing those who somehow behave irrationally, meaning not socially well adjusted, as mad, and therefore in need of isolation, treatment, and perhaps institutionalization, and implicitly qualify those who make this distinction in this particular way as rational.
So rationality and madness are products of power.
Yes, meaning also that madness is not some individual problem or aberration. It's a social disease. So the charge of you or me or anyone being mad can be reversed, as indeed it was in the 1960s, by representatives of the so-called anti-psychiatry and their followers. It's not me that's crazy, it's society that's crazy.
And what about their relation to sexuality?
This is also about an idea by Foucault, although this is not about your average notion of sexuality, whichever that is. but about our self-understanding.
Ah, wow. Actually, that sounds a lot less radical. I mean, self-understanding is the classic philosophical goal, right? And sexuality actually being about self-understanding sounds counterintuitive, to say the least.
Yes, but hey, radical philosophy should be counterintuitive. And maybe all philosophy should. Anyway, the point is that Foucault had reversed our usual understanding that sexuality was liberated in the 1960s and 70s by emancipatory movements and by the protest generation.
Sex, drugs, and rock and roll again.
Damn right, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And certainly not forget feminism. And for instance, the anti-psychiatry movement I mentioned. And all those psychotherapists in the 1970s that helped us to investigate our feelings and whatever it is that supposedly goes on inside us.
So Foucault didn't believe this therapy thing was liberating.
He thought that it was mostly one more way to discipline ourselves, to continuously be critical of ourselves, distrustful, suspicious, a way to turn our energies inward rather than outward, so that we remain docile beings rather than revolutionary actors or maybe anarchists.
Ah, okay. I mean, I can see the Nietzschean inspiration in Foucault there. So being disciplined is bad, and disciplining yourself is even worse. And is not being disciplined good?
Well, what Foucault mostly wanted to show here is that even, and perhaps especially, when you think that your actions and ideas about yourself and about the world are liberating, this again may be an expression of disciplining.
And how again is this sexual?
The new form of being sexually aware and liberated was for Foucault a new form of disciplining. And maybe more importantly, we are led to use sexuality as a foil, so to speak, in our search for how to understand ourselves, and thus also how to act and how to express ourselves. Sexuality, you could say, is a ruse of modernity, which makes up for the loss of self-certainty or self-awareness, which is present in a more traditional religious culture. Like earlier, we scrutinized the presumed God by reading the Bible. Now we scrutinize our presumed sexuality.
We talked about madness and about sexuality as core elements of the culture wars, core philosophical elements, that is. But there was a third element we haven't yet discussed, language. How does that fit in? Has language somehow become crazy? Is it sexualized? How should we imagine this?
The answer again here should be yes. Yes, language has become somehow crazy. And yes, we talk about sex all the time. In my book on the culture wars, I relate this to the works of Derrida and Foucault. Foucault, as we just discussed, feels that the sexual revolution hasn't so much liberated us as disciplined us. We have learned to obsess over our identity. Sex is the foil for this obsession, and we believe that talk, and more talk about it, is the answer. Think of psychotherapy and, of course, psychoanalysis.
No doubt. Maybe psychotherapy isn't a favorite topic in philosophy, but psychoanalysis certainly is. Especially in French structuralist philosophy and cultural theory, psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan is everywhere.
And when there's Lacan, there's disruption and pathology. For a true Lacanian, there's no such thing as normal or regular sexuality or self-understanding, or for that matter, language. Obviously, psychoanalysis works through language, trying to liberate words that are stuck within the body, so to speak.
Nice metaphor.
Thank you. We can fairly say, I think, that psychoanalysis tries to provoke or unlock a stream of words.
Like the famous stream of consciousness in literature.
Like that. And Foucault, but also Derrida, diagnose what happens to us as a result of the aim and success of this project in different ways. Both diagnose our human condition, so to speak, but Foucault does this more in a political, but also epistemological way, and Derrida more in a literary, rhetorical, but also philosophical style.
In this sense, Foucault is an heir to the French epistemological tradition, from Canguilhem all the way back to Descartes.
While with Derrida, it is both a kind of strict philosophical analysis, Derrida can be very hardcore, and simultaneously a kind of show, don't tell, or show and tell. I mean, with Derrida, it's not just the content commenting on the form, but always also the form commenting on the content. His language does as his language says.
Fascinating, but complicated.
Keeps you on your toes. This is what makes reading Derrida both very difficult and a lot of fun. Most of the time. Some of the time. I don't really know. Derrida somehow evades or eludes understanding or determination or qualification.
Which is also the point.
Precisely. Fascinating and frustrating in equal measure. The thing is, with Derrida, writing is inviting. Inviting an audience, but also inviting more writing and, of course, more reading. And more reading invites more writing. And so on, as Slavoj Žižek likes to say.
So what is it about Derrida and language that is important for the culture wars?
Derrida derailed language, so to speak, or came up with a philosophical perspective to explain and to justify this. Of course, language was derailed earlier already, for instance, by James Joyce in literature and by Ludwig Wittgenstein in philosophy in a very different way.
Don't forget Ferdinand de Saussure here.
Well, it's not so much that I forgot him as that I don't understand him.
Okay. Well, anyways, Derrida's way of derailing language, as you call it, was deconstruction. It is sometimes presented as a philosophical methodology, maybe a kind of radicalized hermeneutics, or just plain confusion, as many analytically minded philosophers feel. What do you think?
I think it's more like an anti-methodology, or an attempt to methodologically escape from the grasp of methodologies and other forms of philosophical disciplining. In that sense, Derrida is like Foucault. Both are kind of philosophical outlaws, but their styles of being so are really different.
Yes, a point we've touched upon already, so it's more a matter of style than of methodology.
Which is also pertinent to the culture wars. Culture wars are mostly about style. Perhaps we could even call them style wars. Anyway, most important about deconstruction is the claim that there are no stable meanings in language or discourse. To illustrate, the legal philosopher Herbert Hart once said that any proposition, statement or rule has a core of certainty surrounded by a penumbra of doubt.
Nicely put and very British.
Very. The so-called critical legal scholars countered that it's more like a sea of doubt in which some islands of certainty might be found.
I think I like that even more.
Then for Derrida, it's more like any such presumed core of certainty is always haunted by its penumbra of doubt, so that it can never be at ease or self-certain, so to speak.
Okay, this is my favorite for sure. We know haunting is one of Derrida's favorite phrases or concepts, which he also deploys in his book Spectres of Marx, to explain why we cannot really get rid of Marx or Marxism. It always returns to haunt us, as we talked about in an earlier podcast.
For the culture wars, it means that no social or personal identity is stable or secure. Or if it is, this is because it is backed up by other discourses or ways of speaking, which aren't stable or secure either. It's almost like a linguistic version of Marx and Engels' famous statement that all that is solid melts into air.
Ah, another favorite. As well as the Spectres of Marx book, by the way. But Derrida is not your average Marxist, right?
Not at all. He is not a Marxist, but then again, he is not a non-Marxist either.
Okay, wait. I got this. Let me rephrase my question to fit a more Derridian answer. Is Derrida a Marxist or is he a non-Marxist?
And the answer is yes. You're getting the hang of this.
We've discussed some of the philosophical sources of the culture wars, how the concepts of madness, sexuality, and language became unmoored, so freed or dislodged, in the 1960s in the works of philosophers like Derrida and Foucault. But it's not just about historical interest. Their ideas somehow fuel the culture wars that we see today. So what are these culture wars today, and how are they fueled by our two pet philosophers?
Okay, we're getting to the business end of our podcast. Probably the best summary I can give you here is that the culture wars are identity wars, and they're being fought in and through language.
Yes, I mean, we touched upon identity earlier, more especially the instability of identity and the obsession with it, according to, respectively, Derrida and Foucault.
And the irony here is that neither Derrida nor Foucault is a proponent of identity politics, either in theory or in practice. Quite the contrary. Many of their followers are, though, or at least many of those who are inspired by French theory or postmodernism. And I guess it's safe to say, also by political and ideological motives.
They fight for a cause and they enlist philosophers or philosophies in this cause. And seeing that sexuality was an important issue in the philosophical perspectives we discussed, it also seems safe to say that the culture wars will often have to do with sex and sexuality.
Very safe. They're often about issues of sex and gender, and nowadays often play out along the lines of what is known as LGBTQIA+.
But also issues like #MeToo and Black Lives Matter. Me Too, of course, is very much sex and gender related, but Black Lives Matter not so much, right? So one could perhaps argue that the culture wars run along two lines, one of sex or sexuality and one of ethnicity. Also, when we think of issues like decolonization and the history of slavery.
Touché. In the spirit of Derrida, do not issues like slavery and decolonization haunt the culture wars?
I'd say so, but what do you think?
Well, if we look at the culture wars of the 1960s and 70s, issues like ethnicity, slavery, and the decolonization did not directly play a role.
Those days being about sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Although they were present for sure, at least implicitly, in the background of activism and politics in those days. Think again of the Civil Rights Movement, the Algerian War of Independence, and the Vietnam War.
All right, let's take a quick look at those in turn. So, civil rights.
Civil rights sounds, well, civil, but in fairness, this was or is about the slumbering civil war in the United States. This is about the undigested consequences of the history of slavery, racial segregation, and outright lynching. This affects racial relations in the US until the present day.
What was the philosophy of the civil rights movement as you saw it then, more than 10 years ago?
Well, I would say then the philosophy was that we must go all out to use legal and non-violent methods to gain full citizenship rights for the Negro people of our country.
Okay, and then the Algerian War of Independence. This experience was burned into the political conscience of a whole generation of French intellectuals. They had to come to terms with their colonial nationalism.
Yes, this is the case for Derrida, but also, for instance, for Lyotard, and of course Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Albert Camus, Simone de Beauvoir, Hélène Cixous, André Malraux, Raymond Aron, and of course, not to forget, Frantz Fanon.
Ah, let's come back to Fanon, but first, what about the Vietnam War?
Well, for the French, the Algerian War sort of replaced the Vietnam War. The French were actually the dominant colonial power in what was called Indochina until the mid-50s. Then the Americans took over. Anyway, Vietnam was also about ethnicity because a disproportionate number of American soldiers who went to Vietnam were black. Partly because they couldn't dodge the draft so easily, partly also because going to Vietnam would pay your college tuition.
Ah, the infamous GI Bill.
But it has to be said, black struggle or the racial problem was never much a prominent part in radical French thought, despite the presence of Frantz Fanon, who played a prominent role in the Algerian War of Independence.
Indeed, Fanon, France's own Che Guevara.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, both were trained as medical doctors, and both eventually gave up practicing medicine because they found out that the injuries people were really suffering from should be dealt with not medically but politically, and radically through revolution.
And Fanon was quite knowledgeable in philosophy and psychoanalysis.
Yes, he had studied psychiatry and also in the late 1940s philosophy with Maurice Merleau-Ponty. So he was interested in the experiences of the body, not just the mind, and in the psychology of the oppression of black people by white colonialists.
What Fanon says is, in the colonized colonial relationship, there is no recognition going on. And that's why Fanon is concerned that racism depersonalizes. It is a denial of recognition. It is the master saying, I do not see you at all.
Although French philosophy certainly influenced Fanon, it seems that in reverse, French philosophy wasn't much influenced by Fanon.
Except perhaps Sartre, who famously wrote a preface to Fanon's book Les Damnés de la Terre, The Wretched of the Earth. Famous because it concluded that violence was justified for the cause of liberation and revolutionary change.
Which is not something we find in Foucault or Derrida.
No, although Foucault perhaps came close, but certainly not for the cause of black liberation.
Although deep down, or say all the way down, Fanon was a Marxist, right?
Yeah, true. He thought race and racism were products of socio-economic domination or capitalism, rather than that racism kick-started capitalism, a view we often encounter nowadays.
So it was all about capitalism for him.
Well, perhaps more of a case of one thing being even worse than the other. Van Oenen did think that racism was fully constitutive for Western thought. Western enlightenment can feel superior because it is racist. While actually Western subjectivity is not much more than what we in academia would call a false positive, as the Holocaust for Van Oenen was nothing much special, just another day at the office for racism.
Interesting. I mean, this resonates also with a lot of Western or supposedly Western self-criticism, like how for Horkheimer and Adorno in the Dialektik der Aufklärung, the Holocaust was just another day at the office for enlightenment.
Accurate analogy. Horrible as it is undeniably correct.
So what we wanted to know is how the culture wars are fueled by our favorite philosophers. But somehow we ended up in the last part of our talk with how real wars, like in Vietnam and Algeria, fueled our philosophers.
Yeah, we got a little carried away there. Although the stuff we talked about is important. And as Foucault himself thought, politics is the continuation of war by other means.
So it seems, but let's try and get back on track. How about the culture wars in the present? How should we understand them, and how are they related to philosophy and to the topics we discussed?
Much of it has to do with sexuality and gender still. Even debates that are apparently about something else, like religion, especially Islam, are often about gender norms in Islam, for instance the hijab. Generally, many discussions and controversies somehow touch upon sex and gender, such as the philosophical legitimacy of the LGBTQIA+.
Can we know what the plus stands for?
No, and that's the point here, right? As it happens, just the other day I was listening to a roundtable discussion in Parliament on the future of Afghanistan, in which an expert was talking about rights, especially women's rights, she added, and also children's rights, and then girls' rights especially.
Right, so any addition immediately asks for one more addition.
Yes, C6 and so on again.
Right.
Because any new addition and any further determination automatically creates the need to be even more specific, even more inclusive. Or more philosophically, any added positive automatically invokes further implied negatives, which then have to be corrected by adding more positives.
So we could say that the plus itself is the short form of a dialectics, but ironically, the dominant present-day philosophical perspective allied with such inclusive approaches typically rejects dialectics. That's old-fashioned Hegelianism, they say.
Yes, but here we have proof that it's not so old-fashioned. And that Foucault, for one, was right when he said that no matter how hard you try to outrun or outsmart Hegel, he will be there right around the next corner, silently waiting for you.
That's a haunting experience on its own. But so can we say that the culture wars are about trying to outrun or outsmart Hegel?
Philosophically speaking, that's not too far off. It's the continued search for what Adorno called negative dialectics. Dialectics that does not imply policing, so to speak.
Policing being the opposite of being inclusive.
Yes, that would be the politically correct way to put it. I think Adorno was also looking for dialectics that doesn't invoke false positives, so to speak.
So what are these false positives?
Well, such as LGBTQI and A. I mean, the plus retroactively undoes or deconstructs the positivity of the letters or the identities that preceded.
Right, while the philosophy inspiring LGBTQIA+ will probably claim that the plus affirms these preceding identities.
Yes, the nonplussed identities, as it were.
Okay, nice philosophical point, but can you be a little bit less cryptic?
Yeah. So, the politically correct or woke philosophy will say that the plus stands for a whole potential field of marginalized sexual identities which have not yet surfaced. But once they do, should be immediately recognized and respected, welcomed into the LGBTQIA+ community.
So no balloting and no screening.
Well, I guess there's a lot of balloting and screening, but we'll never know, because any explicit statement of criteria is already not inclusive.
Because it's a form of policing.
Yes. While the Hegelian-inspired philosophy, or perhaps I should say here the Zizek-inspired philosophy, would say that the plus stands for the negation of the previous identities, as well as indeed the creation of a host of possible false positives, or new identities, or new identity letters.
So the plus stands for being more than any single category. People are not reducible to their categories. So what identities are there according to this Žižekian philosophy?
Good question. I guess the straight answer would be that all identities are false negatives.
So perhaps he wants us to directly identify as the plus, as that which escapes the categorization.
Yes, but paradoxically, these identities become false when they try to become positive, which is the Lacanian streak in Zizek's Hegelian philosophy.
I guess in this way it is not as dialectical then, in which the identity category can also be a stepping stone to further understand yourself. In this regard, Zizek seems closer to Foucault, right?
And Derrida as well, I would say.
Okay, we just got caught up in a discussion about Foucault, Derrida, Zizek, and identity as false positive and or false negative. I think it got a little complicated, especially given that it somehow had to do with outrunning Hegel. But let's remind ourselves and our listeners why this was relevant again for the culture wars.
Because I say so.
Right, the most enlightened of all answers. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, but in my book, Culturele Veldslagen, Culture Wars, I argue that the culture wars are a product of an event in the 1960s, an outburst of radical and unruly philosophy, best exemplified in the thought of philosophers like Foucault and Derrida.
Wait, event here doesn't imply or simply refer going to a party or something, right?
No, event is a philosophical concept. It stands for a sudden, almost inexplicable outburst in philosophy or culture that radically alters or changes the meaning or perspective within a field or domain.
So, French theory in the 1960s is an event in philosophy as, say, afterwards, philosophy could never be the same again.
And ironically, identity politics plays a crucial role in these culture wars.
Even though, as you said, they may not have been big fans of it. And what about social justice? This seems to be another core notion in the culture wars. Is the fight for social justice also opposed to the philosophy of thinkers like Foucault and Derrida?
Social justice. You want to up the ante? The short answer here is yes.
Okay, and the long answer is?
Also yes. I think for Foucault this is even quite obvious. He was never comfortable with justice talk, as you can see, for instance, in his famous discussion with Noam Chomsky.
Which was right here in the Netherlands, in Eindhoven, back in 1971, but still around on the internet.
Yes, in which Chomsky argued that the cause of justice required making a revolution. And Foucault countered that the revolution was certainly called for, but not for the cause of justice.
We have to attack the practices of justice. We have to attack the police and their practices. But in terms of war, and not in terms of justice.
And the only, I would like to slightly reformulate what you said. It doesn't seem to me that the difference is between legality and ideal justice. It's rather between legality and better justice. Now, this better system may have its defects, certainly will. But comparing the better system with the existing system and not being confused into thinking that our better system is the ideal system, we can then argue, I think, as follows, that the concept of legality and the concept of justice are not identical. They're not entirely distinct either. Insofar as legality incorporates justice in this notion, in this sense of better justice, referring to a better society, then we should follow and obey the law and force the state to obey the law and force the great corporations to obey the law and force the police to obey the law.
So what was it for then? Just for the heck of it, or?
Oddly, perhaps, yes, for the heck of it. Or more precisely, because once you put revolution in service of some cause, or any cause, you are already betraying it.
Sounds like Albert Camus' Metaphysics of Revolt to me, or existential metaphysics, maybe existentialix, or of revolt, or whatever.
To me as well. Here, Foucault and Camus are much in sync, I would say. Also because it appeals to the surrealist inspiration that's also present in Foucault, especially in his analysis of madness.
And is that the same for Derrida?
No, Derrida was not as averse to justice talk as Foucault, as he was not as averse to talk about emancipation. He even said that deconstruction is justice. But this has to do with the messianic streak in Derrida's philosophy.
I feel like we're back with these specters of Marx, or maybe specters without Marx.
Right. The specter of Marx is from the past, but about the future. That we are haunted by it means that we must have some expectations about the future. That getting rid of injustices is somehow possible, or at least part of the way that we conceive of the future. Our post-Marxist condition is that we are still moved by the messianic promise that was inherent in Marxism, at least to Jewish thinkers like Derrida, while simultaneously mourning or grieving the part of Marxism that no longer moves us, so to speak.
That doesn't sound like the kind of social justice demanded by what some call woke activists, or, if you don't like that term, by many present-day activists and protesters, for instance, regarding climate change or the bloodshed in Gaza.
Derrida would never say that you can demand justice. Justice for him is more like an invitation. It has to do with hospitality. So perhaps we can say that the revolution is inviting and hospitable in this sense, the sense of being open and receptive.
I'm not sure if I get it, and that doesn't sound very militant.
It is very demanding, though. Being open and receptive is really, really hard. But it isn't political. In a view like Derrida's, once you politicize justice, it ceases to be justice. Justice cannot be divisive.
Although I think those in the culture wars who appeal to social justice will also claim that this is about bringing people together, not dividing them.
And paradoxically, this shows how the culture wars are in fact divisive. All parties involved claim to be open and receptive to bring people together and to resist injustice. But this seems to result in driving them further apart.
So is there an end in sight for the culture wars? Some resolution?
Not really, I'm afraid. But I think Derrida is right about this point. If there is to be an end to the culture wars, it will have to somehow present itself. We cannot demand them to be over.
Unlike this episode of our podcast, which I now demand to be over. This podcast was made possible by the Erasmus School of Philosophy and the Center for Learning and Innovation at Erasmus University Rotterdam. A special mention goes out to Mirjam Fuselier and Sun Liu. Thank you, Sam Vitikainen, for the beautiful opening and closing theme. Daniel Nolet for his expert mastering. And thanks to Ludo de Bo for his insights and guidance in this project. Finally, we would like to thank our editor extraordinaire, Max Wassink.